and this is part 5 of the Unit 2 review. In this section, we will be focusing on population dynamics. This is a great graph to start with. What we are looking at here is all the different factors that go into making a population grow and shrink, and all of the terms that go along with that. So let's start down here at the origin of the graph. What we are looking at with the green line is a population as it begins to grow. In this example, that green growth up until right about here, that green growth is exponential. And the reason why it is exponential growth is because it is not limited by any factors, limiting factors. And so they're able to grow at their biotic potential. Biotic potential, remember, is that little r would be the letter that we would use to show just how fast can you reproduce. It's going to vary depending on how early you reproduce, your generation time. It's going to vary based on how many are reproduced in a litter. It's going to vary based on how fast that gestation period is. Something like an elephant, 2-year gestation, humans 9 months, bunny rabbit a month. And so all of those factors will play into your biotic potential. Even something like a dandelion has biotic potential. It produces thousands of seeds. And again, that's its reproductive potential if there are no limiting factors. And so again, a population grows exponentially until it nears or passes the carrying capacity. And that big K we also use to represent those K-selected organisms, and those are organisms that tend to reproduce more slowly. They tend to care for their young. The idea is invest highly in the young and make sure that they all survive. And you're only going to have 1 or 2. This is exactly what apes and people do. We're not going to turn our backs on our children like a rat might do, or like a roach or an insect certainly does. And so that carrying capacity line is really ultimately determined by the environmental factors that are around. How much food is there? How many predators are there? And all of those factors add into the environmental resistance. So limiting factors, population parameters, population density issues, all of that is environmental resistance. If that resistance gets bigger, if it increases, it pushes down on your carrying capacity. As soon as your population has passed the carrying capacity, you will suffer from that. We call it a dieback. Sometimes the dieback is very severe, sometimes it's quite minor. In this graph it looks pretty minor, just a few individuals lost, but we see that it trends, and so they continue to have a declining population until there are few enough individuals that everybody feels the reduction of environmental resistance, and then population grows again. We ultimately hope to see a stabilization around that carrying capacity, and this is ultimately what we are seeing. It does not stop going up and down, but it is relatively stable. So again, you've got biotic potential, you've got environmental resistance. Those are going to help determine where your carrying capacity line will end up. And again, exponential growth, when it levels out, we call it logistic growth. And again, those limiting factors have a big influence on your population, and most organisms have a range of tolerance for different factors. And this is a great picture to represent that. We have a fish population here. The line is showing us the abundance of organisms. So in this pond, we have the biggest abundance of organisms when our temperature is in the optimum range. And it doesn't give us numbers to tell us what that is, but we can see on our bell-shaped curve that this is, our standard deviation. Now, when we get a standard away, we see a massive decrease in the abundance of fish. So we have few organisms. We're getting out of tolerance levels. So here you are stressed. You still can survive, but you can't survive very long. And stress with fish produces a disease called ick. It can produce a lot of other factors. With humans, stress causes anxiety and depression. So we know that stress can have real manifested effects. So we call this area the zone of stress. If you go one more standard deviation away, you have hit the higher limit of tolerance. The tolerance has been exceeded. You have no organisms living there. And so again, the range of tolerance is what can an organism take? There's ideal situations, and then there's what you can live with. Ideally, I would love to live in San Diego. The weather seems like it's great. And that's why you do have an abundance of people living in California. You've got opportunity, you've got jobs, you've got great weather, and then you get fewer and fewer organisms or fewer and fewer people living, let's say, in Nevada, and then fewer people in Utah. It starts to get stressful out there, not very many jobs, not very many opportunities. And again, that's using humans as an example, which is hard to do with ecology, but you get the idea. In this picture, we're going to be, again, looking at that population growth and dieback, but over time, we see that the population stabilizes, and this is when we would call it logistic growth. So it's the same idea as the graph we saw in the beginning. We see a population overshoot, we see a dieback or a crash, recovery right around carrying capacity. Again, we start out with exponential growth. Even though a sheep doesn't reproduce as quickly as a roach, we still are going to see that trend. We have seen it with the human population, and we are still growing exponentially in that J-shaped curve. Logistic is an S shape, exponential J-shaped. Now there are different types of population fluctuations that will occur in nature. The four categories are stable, eruptive, cyclic, and irregular. And stable is pretty much, they're all, quite frankly, pretty much exactly what they sound like. A stable population does not have much change at all. Maybe you might think of this as being a population of, let's say a population of cattle on a ranch. It stays fairly stable. The farmer knows what his land can hold, and he keeps his numbers right around that number. So they would have a stable population. Eruptive is a population that has these massive, massive shoots that go way, way up. The one that comes to mind for me is the 7-year cicada. We've got cicadas every year, but every 7 years we get an eruption of cicada numbers, and it is just phenomenal to see. Now, cyclic fluctuations are pretty typical. And this is what you saw in your lab. You saw that the wolf population went up, or the weasel population went up when the mice population was up. And then with more predators, the mice population died down, and so then the weasel population died down. And we're used to seeing those types of things. And we can also predict what's going to happen based on a regular occurrence of booms and busts. For example, you might have a plant species that tends to flourish in the summer months. Maybe it's an algae that does very, very well in hot weather. And so you'll see a population boom, and then when fall hits, you'll see a population bust. So it's not always going to be related to predator-prey interactions, but cyclic means you can predict it. Irregular population change, we've got no idea why it does what it does, but we know that it goes up and down with no rhyme or reason as far as predictability. And so again, they're all fairly easy terms to remember. This is your population of a hare and lynx. This is very, very similar to your lab that you did on the weasels and the mice. And what we see is that when the hare population increases, the lynx population increases a few years after that. They can't happen at the same time. And I'm looking specifically, this is a great example right in here. Again, the rabbit population is going to increase, and it's going to take a couple years for this population to increase as well. It takes a while for that next generation to get healthy and breed up its numbers. But again, this would be a boom and a bust cycle. We see the ups and the downs, and they're fairly predictable. R and K selected species, I already talked about this a little bit, but one of the things to keep in mind is that R selected species have very, very quick growth. K selected species, it tends to be much slower, especially it tends to slow down near the carrying capacity level. Now some characteristics again for R selected, they're going to reproduce quickly, they're going to be able to reproduce early in life, they're going to have large batches or litters or seeds. However they reproduce, they're going to produce lots at a time. They don't typically care for their young, whereas K-selected species are bigger. It takes them longer to reach sexual maturity. They tend to have only one or few young, but they invest heavily in those young so that they are sure to survive. And oh, what was I going to say? You've got your rhinoceros as an example here. A rhino will have a baby again maybe once every 5 to 6 years. It's going to raise it. It won't have another offspring until that first one has been reared and is independent. So again, that's what a case-selected species tends to do. Life history patterns. These are fun. This is basically, we'll talk about this when we get to human demography too. This is looking at when do we think you're gonna die. A type 1 life history pattern is typical for humans. What we see is that most of our population survives, so percent or number of survivors on the left-hand side. Most of the population survives until middle age and beyond, and that's when you start to see an increase in death rates or a decrease in population. So type 1, again, tend to have your larger animals here, tends to be things like humans. Type 2 survivorship is the interesting one. You are just as likely to die at any point in your life history. A good example here is birds. A bird might fall out of its nest as a baby. It might get eaten by a predator as a young chick. It might fly into a window as a middle-aged adult bird, and then it could ultimately just die one winter if it gets to be old. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Things just tend to die at a pretty predictable rate in type 2. And type 3, this is most typical of an R-selected species. The idea with type 3 is flood the market and see what sticks. So you've got examples like the sea turtle, where you might have 300 to 400 eggs in a nest. They'll all hatch at one time and make a mad dash for the ocean. Well, on the way, they're going to see that there's raccoons and birds and lots of predators that are waiting to pick them off. Only a few will make it. The ones that do make it tend to survive pretty well into old age. It's pretty much the opposite of type 1. So again, type 3 is most typical for animals that are going to have massive numbers for reproduction. Roaches do not think that all of their offspring will survive, and it's too bad for us that so much of them do. Okay, moving on, we've got different types of biodiversity. So looking around from the top left in a clockwise motion, functional diversity, this is looking at our ecosystem services. What does nature, what do ecosystems do for us? They recycle our matter, they make energy flow. These are all things that are necessary to the functioning of a place. Top right-hand corner, ecological diversity, that we have different biomes. This is becoming even more important as we look at climate change. Plants are needing to migrate, animals are needing to migrate, and the fact that we have diverse habitats for them to migrate into is a good thing. Species diversity, on bottom right, this is the most common type of biodiversity that we talk about. When we just say the word biodiversity, we're really talking about species diversity. And then genetic diversity, which is incredibly important as we move on to talk about evolution. In species richness and species evenness, these are different measures of biodiversity that we talked about. Richness means you got a lot of different types, like in a rainforest. Evenness means you pretty much have all the same thing. There are times when one is good and there are times when the other is good. Generally, you want a balance of both. You do not want a monoculture. We know that now, hopefully, from Vanishing of the Bees. Okay, so in that evolution, the first thing that has to happen is having that genetic biodiversity. So you have to have genetic variation, mutations in your reproductive cells. And then for that to get passed on, it has to be heritable and it has to make you a better reproducer. And that's the term differential reproduction. Those are the biggest issues here. You've got to have it in your genes so you can pass it on, and it's got to make you a better pick for a mate. We talked about bacteria and how they can be selected through antibiotics to super evolve. And we talked about already that you've got 3 choices if conditions change. You can adapt, you can migrate, or you can become extinct. And so these are reasons why populations may need to evolve over time. So in summary, it's genes that mutate, individuals that are selected, and populations evolve so that they are better able to survive and reproduce under existing environmental conditions. This is a look at your different selections.